Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening. I'm your host, Steve Taylor. What you're about to hear is a chapter from Waking Nightmare, a collaborative, interactive, serialized horror saga presented to you by Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Each chapter of this series is written week by all of you, our listeners, and only you can tell us how the story unfolds. At the conclusion of today's chapter, those of you in the audience will be asked to help write the next chapter in the saga and to participate by posting it as a comment on this very video. After a week of voting, the chapter with the most upvotes will become canon and will be adapted to audio as the next official installment of the series. Without further ado, settle in, get cozy, and brace yourself. You're about to experience one-of-a-kind horror storytelling in the form of a waking nightmare.
Waking Nightmare, Chapter 3. Written by Jackson Barnard. Narrated by Dr. Creepen. Featuring Jason Hill. A rusty orange glow continued to punch through the thick mist. Blobs of shadows swam and sank, bobbed and weaved, as ash fluttered to the ground like heavy snow. He assumed the shadows were buildings, not tall and ethereal like city skyscrapers, but large enough from the ground to distinguish a definite civilization built into the land.
Land.
A place away from this hellhole. A gift to a homesick sailor who has seen his fair share of nightmarish things. A light at the end of a deep, dark tunnel. He had hope. Or he would have had hope if everything hadn't been on fire. The horrid screams died down, and a cacophony of crackles from the flames echoed across the water. Sound permeated well enough through the fog, but he still couldn't measure the distance. He had no idea if he was a mile or a dozen leagues from shore. All he could see was the soft glow of the distant flames, like lightning striking through clouds on a summer's sunset. He looked to his hand, blood still fresh from the bird. The orange pill bottle stared back silently. He pocketed the gift as the wind howled across the ship's deck. It scraped along the rough exterior of the boat, flitting through open portholes and screaming off the bow. It shrieked in his ears, and he reflexively covered them with his scarred hands.
The updraft must be powerful.
Flames like that could be deadly, even from afar.
And suppose some random ember makes its merry way onto the boat.
The ship looked long overdue for a safety inspection. Splintered wood peeled away from the deck. Holes dotted the floor, as if mini-meteors had punched through. Rust had consumed the walls, rivers of brown grime, snaking from the stern to the back port and starboard sides. The entire boat was a dry match in a deep ocean, just waiting for an excuse to go up in flames. And he, the unwilling captain of the ship, would go up like a Viking funeral.
Unless I jump ship.
Not a bad plan. He peered back over the starboard side, just to see the water's edge fall away from him for an eternity. The reflection of starlight winked from atop the ghastly waves, which themselves only hinted at how far down the unforgiving ocean really was. Jump from this height was inconceivable. At that moment, the mist seemed to part like curtains raising before a dark auditorium. The morbid glow of flames intensified as light found no trouble getting from the city to his eyes without the disturbance of a fog bank. As it turned out, the ship wasn't very far from the city. He immediately wished he was farther away. Buildings, houses, towers, cars, streets. Everything was on fire. Some structures were half caved in, like a botched lobotomy. The surgeon mercilessly cut open steel beams, girders, windows, and flooring to reveal the juicy insides of modern architecture. Picked out the organs that were walls, furniture, a random assortment of electronics, and even bodies, and just left it all there to rot. Some structures were burned down to their foundations, and yet the flames persisted. The buildings, however, were the least of his worries at that instant, and did not warrant his full attention. And the present moment seemed to stretch for a lifetime. He had heard the screams just minutes earlier. He didn't really want to see the source of the agony. But here was the proof in the pudding. Carcasses of fresh people littered the streets, their skin broiled down to the bone, hair aflame, clothes dirty, shredded and tattered. The bulk of them lay dormant in the streets. Some had died in their cars, the frames of which continued to melt even now. Some of the victims had decided to take matters into their own hands, so jumped into the ocean from the solitary pier. The corpses of the smart ones floated on the surface like buoyant bags of muscle and bone. He had seen enough. With tremendous efforts, he tore his gaze from the carnage and sat down, his back to the stern wall. He didn't believe he had eaten anything before, but if he had, he would have regurgitated it all in that instant. He cursed the ship he was on. He cursed the city in flames behind him. He cursed the ocean for existing. And he cursed the thing below decks. That
Demon.
God! There is no God. There is only you and me together forever.
He expected it to pop out of the deck like a deranged jack-in-the-box, with a toothy smile and shallow eyes, wearing a dinner bib around his grotesque neck, and a knife and fork in each hand, or whatever it had in place of hands. Then it would lunge at him and devour him without hesitation. But it didn't. For all he knew, it stalked the bottom of the stairwell, searching for another way up. It was too wide to fit through the narrow gap that he'd come through, but other routes wouldn't be a problem. Say, for instance, the smokestack, or the funnel, or one of the hundreds of portholes along the side of the ship. He was still exhausted from his climb up, and the pain in his right flank was excruciating. Curling a tender hand beneath his shirt, he rolled it up and inspected the damage. A gash, semi-dried with blood, met his gaze. He grunted with annoyance. All things considered, from his collection of other scars and scratches, this newest edition wasn't too bad. But it might get infected if he didn't tend to it. With some effort, he ripped a large swatch of his shirt and wrapped it around his torso.
There. That should stop the bleeding. I hope.
The sun had set hours ago, but the night air was warm. Warm enough that even though he wore the tattered remains of just half a shirt, he didn't much mind. He glanced through his makeshift bandage. Besides, he thought it wouldn't have mattered much if it was a chilly night or not. He would have had to wrap up his wounds one way or another, and he didn't want.
The bandage.
Something caught his eye. A tag sticking out from the green fabric. He hadn't noticed it before when he ripped it off from his sweaty body. It was probably from the inside of his shirt, he imagined. He figured he must have unknowingly turned his shirt inside out while attending to his injuries. In the dim light cast by the stars above, it was difficult to discern, but he peered as close as he could to the stitched white fabric and read aloud several words.
Heed the bird. Her gift will show the way.
Another riddle. More odd words in an odd world.
Filed that one with the others he'd seen earlier on the red door.
Lesa, tap, lesa, tip, ogni.
No, that wasn't right. In his panic, he had forgotten the strange words he'd read earlier.
Lesa tip ogni speranza forci entrance. Entrant? Entrant?
He had no idea what they meant. Perhaps it was a clue. A clue to escape the wretched ship and return to what? His life? What life had he led before this nightmare? He couldn't remember. The only other clues he had to a life before the ship were his wounds and scars. They were his documentation to previous fears and monsters. He didn't want to know what had happened to him in a past life. Suddenly, the ship lurched. He was thrown to the floor, began sliding starboard.
What's going on?
The ship was turning. Something, or someone, was controlling the ship and making it turn to the left. He stood up carefully, putting weight on the balls of his feet, and leaned against the stern wall. The flaming city was much closer now. The lonesome pier drifted slowly away as the boat turned toward a new horizon.
We're too close. Too close. We're gonna crash.
But the boat stayed steady and just barely missed one of the walls enclosing the streets of the city. Flames continued to wave and flicker their warm greetings to him as he passed. More homes on fire, more buildings ablaze, more bodies sprawled on the asphalt. Everything seemed to stretch off into the distance, but not forever as he had previously imagined. There was a curve to the walls and sandy beaches ahead. The city was not built on solid land, leading to the inlands of a foreign world. It was built on an island. The city was an island. As he stood solemnly looking at the lost city in the middle of the ocean, he wondered where the ship was taking him, and if there was a destination in mind at all, if there even was an end goal to the madness that was this world at sea. The demon had said it was just the two of them together forever, perhaps stuck eternally on the vessel. But what if there were more creatures lurking in the swirling darkness below deck? He had seen the horrifying monsters down there, precursors to the demon. What else lurked in the darkened abyss? He was living in a nightmare, and he had a feeling it wouldn't end anytime soon. Not until he had answered his own questions and finished the ghastly game aboard this ship from hell. He thought of the dove. The bird had helped him, had come to his aid.
At least, I'm not alone.
Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and you've been listening to Waking Nightmare, a collaborative, interactive, serialized horror saga presented to you by Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Who decides where the story goes next? You do. That's right, you. Every chapter of this story will be written by those of you in our listening audience, and every week, someone else has a chance to win. To submit the next chapter, simply write it and then submit it as a comment on this very video with the word chapter and the chapter number on your first line. The limit on the length of the YouTube comment is currently 9,500 characters, or about 1,866 words. To ensure your chapter is submitted successfully, be sure not to exceed these limits. If your comment posts successfully, you may consider your chapter accepted, and it will be considered for production and can be voted upon immediately by the viewing audience. Voting will go for 1 week, and after that point, the submission with the most upvotes will be declared the winner and will be adapted to audio as the next official chapter in the series. A word of caution: entries which have been edited after their initial posting will be deemed ineligible, so be sure to double-check your work before posting. If changes are needed after you've submitted your work, you will need to delete your original comment and repost it from scratch. And if your chapter doesn't turn heads 1 week, don't get discouraged. Each chapter will present another opportunity for you to determine where the story goes, and another chance to have your installment selected by the audience. Thank you all for listening and for participating in The Waking Nightmare. We look forward to seeing where you make this story go. Until next time, I'm your host, Steve Taylor, inviting you to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.